Hello everyone, welcome to Art with Kendra. In this video, I'm not going to paint a thing like I normally do or draw a thing. What I'm going to do today is demonstrate 4 different watercolor techniques that are really good to know for your watercolor paintings. We are going to cover wet on wet, wet on dry, dry on dry, and finally dry on damp. Now, my favorite one of these techniques is wet on wet. So we're going to start off with that. And just to demonstrate this, I'm going to give myself a shape. I'll do a heart. My daughter loves drawing hearts, so we'll do a little heart for my daughter here. So I am going to fill this heart with water. So the water is going to be the first wet. So we are going to apply water, and you could do this with wet paint as well. It doesn't have to be water. There's actually a little bit of paint in my brush. I'm seeing just a little bit here. There we go. So here's our wet surface. Now what I'm going to do is go in and I'm going to add some wet paint. All watercolor is wet, but what I mean by wet paint is I'm going to be really saturating my brush with a combination of water and paint. Now you always need to add water to watercolor. Always, always, always. All right, look at that move. Isn't that gorgeous? I'm just going to zoom in a bit here. I'm going to add a few little blooms of, look at how it moves into the water. So this is wet on wet. You really see that kind of control here. So the whole surface of our subject matter is wet. Sometimes people have the whole page wet. I'm going to add a little bit of orange here, not orange, yellow, which will create a little bit of orange. I'm just going to dab it in here. There we go. This orange has a little hint of green in it, doesn't it? So with wet on wet, your colors just, they kind of move into each other. They do their own thing. You have a little bit of control, but you don't have a ton of control, right? The water really, really controls that paint. And the page itself also controls the paint. You're going to get pooling in certain areas where the page kind of dips down, and the page is going to dry faster where the water kind of pushes away from, right? I'm going to add a little bit more really wet paint here. You can see it just moving really nicely into that space. So that's wet on wet, and that's going to take us a little bit of time to dry, but that's all right. What is color? I think this is blue. There we go. There. So we'll just kind of come back to this one later and see where we're at with it. But that's wet on wet. So the paint just kind of goes into the water and the water moves it around the page. Wet on dry is my next favorite one. So with wet on dry, you do have wet paint, but you also have a dry surface that you kind of control. So I'm going to start off with some teal. Let's do a little bit of teal here. There's our teal, but I'm painting onto a dry surface, right? So I can control where that goes. Now you can incorporate a little bit of wet on wet onto the wet on dry if you want to. So I could do a bit of a blend here if I wanted to kind of move into a little bit more yellow. I could kind of do that, and I would get a little bit of that kind of blend happening, which is nice, but it does allow you to have a little bit more control. Just having lots of water on your brush and then applying it to the page, and you get this beautiful full coverage because your page is dry. You know exactly where that's going to go, but you have lots of paint, that wet paint that gives you the coverage. All right. Now we're going to move into dry on dry. So water is always a part of watercolor painting. Dry on dry just means that you have a little bit less paint on your brush and you have no water on the surface. So I'm going to clear most of this off my brush so that my brush is nice and dry. And then what I'm going to do is pick up just a small amount of paint. This paint still has water in it, okay? But there's not that much on my brush. So now what I'm going to do is go on my page. You can see that I'm actually getting texture. I wasn't getting texture before, was I? Because there was too much water on my brush and everything just kind of blended into itself. But by just putting a little tiny bit of paint on our brush, right? So there's not that much going on here. We have control and we can add textures. Look at that. This is the belly of the brush, right? I'm using the whole base of the brush to get that texture. You can get really nice texture with a fan brush because you have the separation of the bristles. So you can just add a little bit of paint onto your fan brush and you'll get beautiful texture. So that's dry on dry. And finally, we have dry on damp. The reason I say damp is because if it's too wet, everything's going to kind of move and just like we saw before, even if you have a dry brush, it won't kind of stick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of water. I'm going to do a little bit of yellow, but I'm not going to have too much there. So it's not like a puddle. All right. So it's almost a dry brush, but it's a damp surface still. All right, so it's still damp. I just painted it. Now I'm going to go in with my green, but I'm going to make sure again that I don't have too much on my brush. All right, not too much on my brush. So I'll be able to have lots of control here. The colors aren't going to be as potent, but it's not going to move as much as the wet on wet did. So I'll be able to have a little bit of control here. Right, and I'm picking up a little bit of water as I go as well, but I'm not pooling. It's not moving like it did with the wet on wet. So there's a little bit of control here. Like I could kind of draw a thing and you can still see what that thing is at the end of the day, unlike with the wet on wet where it just moved everywhere. Just going to take a little pan out so we can see all of these different techniques. So this again is wet on wet. You can see that whole thing moved. Colors are doing their own kind of blending, still very wet. Wet on dry where you have the control, you can carve in shapes. You have dry on dry where you can get these nice textures, and you have dry on damp where you maintain a little bit of control, but you still have a little bit of that bleed, but not nearly as much as we have up here. Well, I hope this was useful for you. I recommend trying all of these different painting techniques on your own. See what happens with different amounts of water for your wet on wet, those sorts of things. All right. Thank you so much for watching the video, painting with me. If you want to see some of my art, you can check out my Instagram, creations_by_Kendra, or you can find me on Facebook at Creations by Kendra. Thank you so much. Bye.